Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere you probably shouldn't. You've wandered into the seediest, dampest corner of the medieval world. And no, it's not a dungeon, it's far worse. You're stepping into a medieval brothel, and let me tell you right now, you probably won't survive the night. Not because someone's going to stab you though. That's entirely possible. But because your senses, your immune system, and probably your dignity are about to be thoroughly dismantled. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling brave, drop your location and local time in the comments, so I know where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You approach the brothel through a narrow, uneven alley, barely wide enough to pass without brushing up against walls coated in things best left unidentified. The stones underfoot are slick from the rain, or maybe not rain. Who can say anymore? Each step echoes with a squelch that makes your stomach lurch. Rats scurry past like they're late for appointments, and somewhere a cat wails like it's seen something, even it didn't want to. You've seen the signs, heard the whispers in the taverns. This is a place where scenes are sold cheap and coins stretch long. The wooden sign above the door is weathered, barely readable, but the crude painting of a woman reclining on a barrel tells you all you need to know. You push the door, and it groans open with a squeal that sounds vaguely like protest. Immediately, a wall of heat and odor hits you like a battering ram. The air is thick, humid, suffused with the scent of unwashed bodies, boiled cabbage, wood smoke, and something acidic you can't place. It's not just unpleasant, it's oppressive. You can almost feel the bacteria crawling up your nostrils. If you didn't know better, you'd think the building itself was sweating. Inside the room is dim, lit by uneven candlelight that makes every shadow dance. The wax drips onto greasy wooden tables, where men slump with tankards, their eyes glassy, their clothes stained with ale, and God knows what else. A woman with hollow eyes and a crooked smile saunters past you, her bodice askew, her hair more straw than silk. She doesn't speak just, appraises you like a carpenter evaluating poor quality lumber. You're clearly not a local. That much is obvious. Your cleanish clothes, your lack of visible scabs, and the way you hesitate at the threshold mark you as fresh meat. A few heads turn in your direction, some out of curiosity, others out of habit. You can feel the attention settle on you, like mildew on bread. You move farther in, careful not to touch the walls, which are sticky in ways you don't want to think about. A man in the corner lets out a wheezing laugh that turns into a cough, so wet and violent it sounds like it might have dislodged part of his soul. No one flinches. That's just background noise here. The bailiff, you can call it, that's manned by someone with arms the size of hams and a face that suggests he has been in more fights than meals. He doesn't say a word as you approach, just raises one eyebrow. You point to a tankard, and he slams one down, filling it with something that looks like ale, but smells like fermented regret. You sip it because, what else are you going to do on? It burns, not in the pleasant way, in that this may have been distilled through an old boot way. The taste is earthy, sour, and oddly metallic. And for a fleeting moment, you wonder if they use rainwater collected from the brothel's roof to make it, or worse. As you swallow and suppress a shiver, your eyes begin to adjust to the murk. You see a stairway leading up to a shadowed hallway. A red curtain hangs limp over what might be a private room, its edges stiff and crusted. A woman passes through it, adjusting her chemise, not even glancing your way. Behind her, you glimpse a man fastening his belt, with hands that tremble slightly. The room is lined with narrow benches and a hearth that barely warms the space, though the heat from bodies makes it almost unbearable. There's a long crack in one wall through which a persistent draft snakes, carrying the occasional smell of horse manure from the street. You pick a corner near the fire, not for comfort, but because it's the farthest from the privy hole in the ground behind a half door. Buzzing with flies and reeking of centuries of poor decisions, someone once said that medieval brothels were cozy little dens of pleasure. That person was either delusional, paid handsomely to write flattering travelogues, or never actually visited one. In reality, these places were somewhere between tavern, tenement, and trap. You might have heard that in cities like Paris, London, or Florence, prostitution was technically legal, even licensed. That's true. In fact, some cities had entire red light districts openly acknowledged by the local government. In 14th century Southwark, just across the river from London proper, brothels were overseen by the Bishop of Winchester himself, who collected taxes from them. They were called the stews, and while they operated under a veneer of legitimacy, they were little better than pits of contagion and exploitation. The church turned a blind eye when convenient and cracked down when politically expedient. Historians still argue whether this selective enforcement was moral hypocrisy or just smart economics. Back to you. Your seat creaks ominously as you lean back, trying to look casual, like someone who belongs here. It's not working. A girl with a face too young and eyes too old sidles up to you, tilting her head. "You lost?" she asks, her voice rough from smoke and years of being ignored. You shake your head, and she doesn't press further. She just slips away, vanishing into the folds of the room like a whisper. You don't see where she goes. You don't want to. Another man stumbles by, trailing vomit and apologies. And a dogan, actual dog tracks through the room, with a dead rat in its mouth. No one stops it. In fact, a few patrons glance at the rodent hungrily. Times are hard. Your skin begins to itch. You're not sure if it's fleas, lice, or just the ambient shame. You remind yourself that you're here for the experience, for the story, for the immersive historical accuracy. But part of you wants to scrub yourself with sand and cry. You breathe shallowly now, trying to minimize contact with the air, as though that'll somehow protect you. It won't. The longer you stay, the more the place seeps into you. Not just the smell, but the fatigue, the resignation, the murky understanding that everyone here has given up something: freedom, health, decency, in exchange for just making it through another night. And you're starting to get it. You're not above them. You're just newer. The only thing separating you from them is time. The barkeep slams another tankard near you. On the house, he grunts. Why? You don't ask. You just nod and sip. This one tastes slightly better. Maybe you're getting used to it. Maybe your taste buds have died. Either way, you're settling in. You've made it into the brothel. The real challenge now is making it through the night. You're still seated, or at least attempting to be, because the stool beneath you wobbles with every shift like it's being held together by fermented breath and good intentions. And every time you lean back even slightly, it gives a wooden groan of protest. that threatens to dump you onto the dirt-packed floor, which, by the way, is now littered with suspicious puddles that reflect the guttering candlelight in a way that makes them look more like portals to another, slimier realm than simple water or ale. And as you brace yourself against the sticky table to steady your balance, you realize, with a slow, sinking revulsion, that your sleeve has come into contact with something both viscous and warm, and rather than investigate further, you withdraw your arm like it's touched fire, now visibly stained by the mystery substance, which has already begun to soak through the cloth like a guilt you can't wash off. But there is no time to reflect, because your attention is dragged toward the source of an angry hiss of women across the room, both of whom look like they've lived a dozen lives and lost more than a few teeth. Between them are locked in a snarling stare down over a client who, amusingly, seems far more interested in the roast turnip on his plate than the impending brawl erupting over his company. And though you half expect hair pulling, or worse, the argument fizzles out as quickly as it began, ending in mutual grunts and a shared sip from a questionable bottle. Because even here, survival sometimes demands cooperation over chaos, and as the moment passes, you feel yourself relaxing, just slightly, foolishly, believing maybe things will settle into some grim, predictable rhythm. But that hope is dashed the moment something small jumps from one woman's sleeve onto the floret's a flea, or maybe a louse, and before you can react, it's joined by another, and then another, and you become acutely aware that this place isn't just full of people, but of other things, little crawling denizens that make the walls hum and the beds rustle. And now your own scalp tingles with psychosomatic panic, prompting you to scratch involuntarily, which only confirms your worst fears. Something is in your hair, whether imagined or not, and as you shiver, your gaze lands on a man sleeping, or perhaps passed out on the bench beside the hearth, his open mouth catching the heat like a funnel, and you notice a single cockroach crawling lazily across his chest, right toward the open collar of his grimy tunic, where it disappears without a trace, unchallenged and apparently well acquainted with the terrain. And if you had any sense left, you'd run, flee into the night, and never look back. But you don't, because now someone else has noticed you, a woman with a sharp nose and sharper eyes, who approaches not like a friend, but like a merchant inspecting livestock. And before you can speak, she clicks her tongue and circles you slowly, noting your shoes, your hands, even your fingernails, which, in hindsight, were far too clean for this place. And she hums thoughtfully before finally murmuring, "You'll last half a night, maybe less," then cackles and walks off, leaving you both insulted and vaguely relieved that she didn't try to sit down, because you're not sure you could handle another layer of scrutiny, especially from someone who clearly knows the rules of this establishment far better than you. And as you turn back to your untouched tankard, a new figure stumbles through the doorway, a man with cheeks flushed scarlet, clothes reeking of fish, and an aura of despair that practically drips off him like sweatened. The moment he enters, the entire room seems to inhale, then hold its breath, as if bracing for something. And sure enough, he begins to shout, demanding the usual while waving a purse that clinks with coins far too loudly. And several girls rush toward him with false smiles and practiced movements. But what you notice most isn't the man or the women, it's the fleas, dozens of them, abandoning his coat in a slow cascade like passengers disembarking a doomed ship, crawling onto the floor and scurrying into cracks. And it hits you then, Not metaphorically, but literally, because one jumps onto your boot, and that's enough to remind you that in a medieval brothel, you're never truly alone, never truly safe, not even sitting still, and especially not when the lice are airborne and the bedbugs are organized. And here's a disturbing thought. Medieval scholars did write about such infestations, though not always with disapproval. Some even believed fleas were part of God's punishment for lust, and thus entirely appropriate to a place like this. A built-in moral tax for pleasure seekers. And though historians still debate whether such brothels kept up basic pest control, it's fairly clear that soap, when used, was applied sparingly, and mostly to hands and faces, not the corners of the rooms or the folds of bedding. Which is why you start to notice that everyone here, from the women to the clients to the staff, has a kind of twitcher constant, unconscious scratching or shifting or brushing at sleeves as if trying to rid themselves of something invisible, which they probably are. And now, so are you, because your ankles itch and your scalp prickles, and you feel your courage starting to crack at the edges. And to make matters worse, the lighting plays tricks on you. Candlelight casts moving shadows that make it hard to tell what's a rat and what's a foot, what's a person and what's a heap of laundry. And at one point, you're fairly sure you see someone sleeping, standing up, nose pressed to the wall like a penitent. But when you look again, they're gone, or maybe they were never there. And all the while, the noise continues. A kind of low-level hum of coughs, groans, laughter, slaps, liquid sloshing, feet shuffling, and a persistent high-pitched giggle from somewhere upstairs that never quite stops. And honestly, that's more unsettling than anything else, because it's too rhythmic, too regular, and you can't shake the idea that it might not be laughter at all, but some kind of ritual because, yes, odd beliefs did flourish in places like this, and fringe accounts suggest some brothels doubled as hubs of folk magic and pagan holdovers, places where charms were sold and curses whispered between transactions. And now, as your eyes adjust more fully to the room, you notice a small bundle of twigs and bones hanging over the doorframe, something that looks like a charm or ward, possibly for fertility or luck or protection, or perhaps ominously to keep something in rather than out tanned. You begin to realize that you've barely scratched the surface of this place as mysteries, and it's already crawling under your skin, not just literally but metaphorically, because this isn't just a brothel. It's a living, breathing ecosystem of decay, desire, disease, and desperation. And even though no one's touched you yet, you already feel changed, tainted, like your clean edges have been smudged. And the worst part is, you know the night has only just begun. You start to get the sense that nothing in this place is what it seems. Not the people, not the prices, and definitely not the so-called services listed on a scrap of dirty parchment nailed near. The stairs written in a shaky hand and barely legible in the flickering candlelight. A cryptic menu of euphemisms and inside jokes that make it nearly impossible to tell whether you're being offered a foot rub, a poisoned meat pie, or something that will land you with boils in places you didn't know you had skin, and you try to decode it line by line. But the moment you get to something labeled the Bishop's Mercy, a woman beside you lets out a wheezing cackle and mutters you wouldn't survive that sober, which isn't comforting, especially since she looks like someone who's endured every item on the list and maybe authored a few herself. And even though you're not here to partake in anything physical, at least, Not on purpose, you realize with a creeping dread that everything in here has a cost, and none of it is fixed. Because in a medieval brothel, pricing is more art than math, fluctuating with the mood, the hour, your face, your boots, your accent, your posture, and even how desperately you're trying to appear disinterested, which, by the way, you're failing at. Because two of the women near the fire have started making subtle gestures in your direction, whispering behind their hands, and you catch the word fresh, which might refer to your arrival, or your nah, or the fact that you haven't yet contracted whatever skin ailment seems to be going round. And now you're wondering how much longer you can sit here without drawing even more attention. Because in this kind of place, being passive doesn't make you invisible, it makes you vulnerable. And you start to notice how everyone is constantly scanning, appraising, like wolves circling a distracted deer. And it dawns on you that choice is more illusion than reality here. Because even if you don't ask for anything, someone might decide to offer it anyway. And that offer might come with strings, or knives, or some expectation you didn't anticipate. And this is when you realize that the real danger isn't just disease or discomfort, it's miscommunication, misinterpretation. The fact that every glance and word is loaded, coded, transactional, and even silence is seen as a move in a negotiation. And suddenly, you recall that medieval brothels weren't just dens of sin. They were tightly managed operations, often licensed by the city or even the church, regulated in ways that would make modern health inspectors weep with confusion. And yes, historians still argue whether such regulations were actually enforced or merely theoretical, since surviving records often list fines and infractions with suspicious regularity, suggesting that the system was more about appearances and bribes than actual safety or justice. And yet these places thrived, because in towns full of celibate clergy, unmarried soldiers, and young apprentices far from home, demand always outstripped decency. And so brothels flourished in plain sight, sometimes even next to churches, a proximity that says more about medieval society than any textbook can. And as you contemplate this strange mix of tolerated vice and selective morality, someone plops down beside you, their presence sudden and heavy, like a sack of flour, and when you glance sideways, you're met with a smile, missing 3 teeth and eyes that shimmer with a mix of curiosity and calculation. And before you can say a word, they lean close and whisper, "You knew." You're sitting like someone waiting for death or dinner. And though the line is meant to be funny, there's an edge to it. And you realize this person isn't here for idle conversation. They're sussing you out, trying to figure out what you're worth, not just in coin, but in leverage. And when you mumble something non-committal, they laugh and slap your back, then offer you a drink from a chipped mug that smells like turpentine and applesauce. And you make the fatal mistake of taking a sip, which sets your throat on fire and your stomach into knots. And while you're still reeling from that first taste, they begin to tell you about the specialties on offer tonight, including a double monk twist and a saddled pilgrim, neither of which you can visualize without grimacing. And you realize you've stopped blinking, just staring at them with wide, unblinking horror, which they interpret as interest, because they lean in further and start detailing the menu in more graphic terms, only stopping when a large man walks by, carrying a live goose under one arm and muttering about being overcharged. And somehow, no one even looks surprised, which tells you that whatever's happening upstairs is several leagues weirder than what's happening down here. and you start to wonder if perhaps these services include rituals, games, punishments, or possibly animal-related theatrics. Because again, fringe accounts do mention brothels that dabbled in the bizarre to attract a clientele jaded by more mundane offerings. And while many of these claims are likely exaggerated or rooted in moral panic, there is enough consistency in the records to make you nervous, especially given that the man with the goose just walked into a room labeled the garden, which is exactly the sort of euphemism that makes your skin crawl. And as your unwanted companion finally rises to leave after stealing another sip from your drink, you take a breath and try to center yourself, only to find that your chair is now partially stuck to the floor, thanks to a puddle of something that looks like spilled ale, but smells like fermented despair. And you decide it's time to stretch your legs, if only to remind yourself you still can. But as you stand, you're immediately intercepted by a girl, no older than 16, who looks tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep. And she grabs your sleeve and says, "Don't go upstairs. Not tonight," and then disappears behind a curtain before you can ask why. And the hair on the back of your neck rises because you don't know her and she didn't know you, and yet she gave you a warning that felt rehearsed, like something she says to all the ones who look too clean, too soft, too alive, and your instinct is to leave immediately, to back out of this wooden nightmare and vanish into the cool night air. But something keeps you rooted, not curiosity, exactly more like inertia, or maybe the dull pull of a story not yet finished. And so you walk the perimeter of the room instead, observing the subtle hierarchies, the zones where different prices and risks seem to cluster. And it becomes clear that the brothel is like a living organism with its own circulatory system, its own immune response, and you're the foreign body, tolerated only so long as you don't disrupt the flow. And you remember reading that in many medieval cities, brothels had bouncers, not the muscle-bound giants of modern times, but men with short swords and quick tempers, often paid by the madam herself, or, in some cases, appointed by the town to ensure no fight spilled into the street. And one such man leans against the wall now, sharpening a knife the size of your forearm, watching the room not like a protector, but like a predator guarding his watering hole. And you wonder what he'd do if you ran for the door, screamed for help, or simply collapsed from the sheer weight of sensory overload. But you do none of those things. You just keep walking, and as you pass a window boarded shut with scraps of cloth, you realize the air feels heavier here, like the walls are holding their breath, and it hits you. This place doesn't just cater to desire. It absorbs, it recycles, it builds it into the floorboards, like sedimentary layers of longing and loss. And now you're part of it, too. A new layer, a new story, another set of eyes that will never quite unsee what they've seen tonight. You've been here too long, and you know it not just by the shifting of eyes toward you, but by the way your body is starting to betray you, itching in places you didn't know could itch, lungs tightening with every breath, like they're slowly surrendering to the thick soup of stale air candles, soot, and centuries old. Despair that saturates every inch of this godforsaken building, and as you try to move with purpose, perhaps to find some corner of you're intercepted by sound, a relentless layering of giggles, hacking coughs, slurred songs, sharp arguments, the creak of wood protesting weight it was never meant to bear, and always, beneath it all, a faint wheeze of breathing too labored to be healthy. And you realize that some of it's coming from people you haven't even seen, from behind doors and beneath stairwells, where the sick are tucked away like forgotten laundry. And you start to understand why this place doesn't just feel haunted, it feels contagious. Not in the metaphorical sense, but in the very real, medieval sense of pestilence hanging in the air. Because back then, disease wasn't some invisible concept, it was a daily certainty. And brothels were infamous for being hubs of infection, so much so that some cities attempted to place them outside the walls entirely. A gesture that was more about moral distancing than actual health policy, since the diseases didn't respect zoning laws. And you remember reading that syphilis first made its catastrophic European debut in the late 15th century, spreading so rapidly through brothels and military camps that it earned nicknames like the French disease, the Neapolitan disease, and even the Christian disease, depending on who you wanted to blame. And while some historians argue about whether it was truly new or just newly aggressive, what no one debates is that it found a perfect ecosystem in places exactly like the slow ventilation, high turnover, poor nutrition, and plenty of bodily fluids. And you're starting to feel the raw weight of that history pressing against your ribs as you edge your way past a table covered in wax-stripped pewter mugs and something that looks like pickled turnips, though you can't be sure. Especially after a large man with a weepy eye sneezes directly onto the bowl and then resumes eating from it. And you swear you hear something squelch when his spoon hits the bottom. And that's when you realize the ale they've been pouring is not just diluted dites, been recycled, mixed with who knows what, and passed through hands that probably haven't seen water since last year's snow melt. And the smell alone makes your stomach cramp, but you force it down, because weakness is blood in the water here, and the sharks are watching. And then there's the sounds again, not just the music and groans and coughing, but stranger things, odd clinks and rhythms coming from the ceiling, like someone is rolling marbles across a wooden floor or dragging something heavy back and forth. And someone else is humming tunelessly off-key and off-putting, and you wonder if there's another floor above you, and if so, what exactly is going on up there? Because you've seen people ascend the stairs and not come back down, which wouldn't be that odd, except that the ratio is now clearly skewed, and the only ones coming down look different, paler, slower, like they've left some essential piece of themselves behind. And now a girl, no older than 12, is sweeping the floor near your feet with a straw broom that serves more to redistribute the filth than clean it. And she glances up at you with hollow eyes, doesn't speak, just keeps pushing the grime around. And you wonder if she's actually employed here or just surviving in the cracks. Because one of the darker truths about medieval brothels was the presence of children. Not always in the cruelest sense, but often enough that it became normalized orphans, serving as errant runners, cooks, cleaners, future employees in training. And though records are vague, some scholars argue that it was not uncommon for children to be bartered into brothels by desperate parents, especially in famine years, and suddenly your stomach turns again because you remember where you are. And you can't unsee the way the air curls around the rafters like a veil, and the way the candle flames hiss when certain doors open and someone stumbles past you naked, drunk, bleeding slightly from the ear end. No one reacts, not even a dog curled under the table, who just lifts its head to sniff the blood, then goes back to sleep. And you think maybe you're dreaming, because the entire room feels like a fever vision. Layers of noise and odor and temperature overlapping in a way that distorts your sense of time. And you sit back down, not because you want to, but because your legs simply fold under you. And that's when the coughing returns, louder now, and closer. and you look over to see a man doubled over, hacking into a handkerchief that comes away bright red, and someone beside him laughs and says, "Must have been a good night," and then hands him another drink. And you think, this is how plagues start. But the irony is, this is how they continue, because in brothels, the sick didn't get quarantined. They got discounted, and customers didn't stop coming. They just paid less, and the cycle kept spinning. And you wonder how many diseases were born, not in battlefields or rat nests, but right here, in places like this, where desperation turned a blind eye to visible illness. And you try to remind yourself that not all brothels were cesspit. Some were cleaner. Some even had rudimentary health checks, at least in theory, and certain cities required weekly doctor visits for the workers, though historians still argue whether those regulations were enforced or simply ignored in exchange for bribes. And while it's tempting to imagine a more orderly version of what you're seeing now, the evidence doesn't support much optimism. And just then, someone bursts into song, a wildly off-key rendition of something about St. Augustine and a pig end. The room erupts into laughter, and for a moment, you're just another figure in a chaos. But it's temporary, because your eyes keep drifting back to the man with the red handkerchief, who has now slumped, sideways, unmoving, and still no one reacts, and that's when it really hits you. This place isn't a brothel in the way you might have imagined it. It's a terminal ward with a bar tab, a waiting room for death, dressed up in perfume and lace and half-melted candles. And yet people still come, still pay, still smile, because in a world with so little joy and even less safety, this place offers. Both, however, fleeting, and you wonder how much longer your own body can hold out against the ambient pressure. The infectious air, the scratches you've already gotten from the chair, the mug, the doorknob, all of it suspect, all of it alive with invisible thread. And when the singing man passes out, face first into a tray of meat pies that are definitely more rat than pork, you feel something close to envy, because at least he gets to lie down. You try to find a place to rest, some sliver of space where your back can meet something solid and your eyes can close without immediately reopening in terror. But here, the act of sleeping is more a calculated gamble than a natural human function. And as you wander deeper into the brothel's winding guts, passing threadbare curtains that might have once been bedsheets or priestly vestments, hard to say in this light, you start to understand why sleep here isn't earned. It's survived, because the sleeping quarters, if they can even be called that, are little more than loosely separated alcoves carved out of necessity, packed shoulder to shoulder like livestock pens, with straw-stuffed pallets that haven't been changed since some forgotten century and smell like the breath of a dead mule. And when you press your hand into one to test it gingerly, because part of you suspects it might groan or scream, you realize the crunch beneath the surface isn't hay, but lice husks, mouse droppings, and possibly the fossilized remains of someone's last bad idea. And yet people are laying here, curled up in cloaks, half-dressed, half-conscious, muttering in their sleep, or clutching things too tightly to be just dreams. And there's an unspoken rule in the air. Don't ask who paid for the bed. Don't ask who used it last. Don't ask whether that stain is blood or worse. Just lie down if you can find a place that doesn't crawl. And even then, good luck, because medieval mattresses weren't just uncomfortable. They were community ecosystems, packed with whatever nature saw fit to donate: fleas, bed bugs, spiders, lice. And there's a scholarly debate still ongoing about how often these beds were shared in shifts. not just by workers, but by the occasional guest or vagrant who slipped in with the shadows. And you suddenly become aware of how little you trust anything that touches your skin now. As if every surface in here is sentient and malicious, and you lean down to peer beneath a bed, only to find a cat watching you, thin as a shadow. Its eyes reflecting the candlelight like twin coins in a wishing well, and it doesn't blink. Just flicks its tail as if to say, "You don't belong here," which is funny because the cat seems to belong more than anyone else. And behind you, someone lets out a snore that quickly becomes a cough, and then silence, which is somehow worse, and the air feels thicker, ear warmer, but not in a comforting way. More like being inside someone's open mouth, humid and sour and unwelcoming. And you catch a whiff of something faintly chemical, though that can't be right because no one uses soap in here, much less anything stronger. And that's when you see a small pot near the bed frame filled with a grayish mixture that smells faintly of vinegar and something else, maybe rosemary. And you recall that in the later medieval period, some brothels did make token attempts at cleanliness, usually at the insistence of city authorities. And that involved potions and rinses that doubled as insect repellent and spiritual protection, though the efficacy of either was questionable, and many believed more in prayers than potions when it came to hygiene, especially among the poor. And some workers would sprinkle herbs like tansy or wormwood into their bedding to ward off pests, though others just gave up and let the vermin feast as they pleased. And as you settle onto a corner of an abandoned mattress, careful not to make full contact, you feel the springs, or what's left of them, grown like an old man being asked to dance, and you realize there are no real rooms here, just zones of increasing compromise, each more unsettling than the last. And in one far corner, you spot a canopy bed, draped in heavy red fabric that looks like it could choke someone just by association. And there's something moving behind it, slowly, rhythmically, and you look away, not out of politeness, but preservation. Because if you try to assign logic to everything in here, you'll break yourself. And now the sounds of sleep surround you, gasps, mutters, grinding teeth. One poor soul whispering the same word over and over in a language you don't recognize, and it's then you feel the first bite, a tiny pinch on your ankle that might be a flea or a spider or some ancient hybrid insect that evolved just for this mattress. And you slap at it uselessly, only to feel another on your forearm and another, and suddenly you're brushing yourself off like a madman, looking for the infestation you already know you can't escape. And in the flickering candlelight, you notice the walls themselves seem to be moving slightly, subtly, a shiver of mold and insects too tiny to name. And you remember that in some brothels, the beds were actually communal sleeping platforms, raised wooden slabs packed with straw and shared by half a dozen people at once, which helped with warmth but also guaranteed the rapid spread of lice, mites, and anything else with legs and a grudge. And while wealthier clients might have rented private rooms, even those weren't clean by any modern standard, walls insulated with horsehair or rags, floors packed with manure to keep out the cold, and the occasional carved headboard that doubled as a hiding place for valuables or weapons. And you begin to wonder how anyone could sleep through this. But then you hear a laugh, a soft one, more breath than sound, and you look up to see a young woman perched in a windowsill, if it can be called that. More like a jagged hole in the wall covered with a scrap of linen. And she's watching you, smiling faintly like she's seen this before. the outsider trying to survive his first night in the hive. And she doesn't say anything, just holds up a finger and mimics a snoring motion. Then leans her head against a stone and closes her eyes. And you almost envy her ability to pretend this is normal, and maybe it is for her. And you start to feel the edges of fatigue pulling at your body like invisible hands, dragging you toward the blackness behind your eyelids. And despite the noise and the filth and the creeping certainty that this mattress has more living things in it than the local swamp, you find yourself drifting, if not to sleep, then to a state adjacent to it, a gray fog where your limbs forget to tense and your breath evens out. And for a few seconds, the world narrows to the creak of rope, the rustle of straw, the soft moaning of the walls themselves. And you think, maybe you'll make it through the night. And that's when something brushes your face. Not gently, not like a hand, but like something crawling in. Your eyes snap open to see a cockroach, the size of a thumb, retreating across your pillow, and suddenly sleep is impossible again. Because now you're aware of all the other things that might be sharing this space. Not just bugs, but the invisible history of every body that's lain here before you. Every fevered dream and whispered name, an unspeakable act, soaked into the wood and straw like a phantom residue. And you sit up again, resisting the urge to scratch at every inch of skin. And somewhere outside, a rooster crows not here, of course, but somewhere beyond the brothel walls. And the sound feels like a betrayal, because it means the sun is rising, or trying to. And you've spent the entire night trying and failing to find a safe place to sleep. And now the day comes, not with comfort or relief, but with fresh waves of noise, new customers, louder arguments, the clatter of pots, and the sharper stink of morning air, thick with old wine and chamber pots being dumped into the alley. And you realize that in a medieval brothel, rest isn't something you're given. It's something you take from the jaws of the room itself, if you're lucky. And if the mattress doesn't bite first, you'd think payment would be the simplest part of the transaction. That coin would exchange hands and services would be rendered. But in a medieval brothel, that idea is as laughably naive as trying to pay your way out of the plague with a smile and a song. Because coin might open the door, but it rarely buys respect, protection, or even what you thought you were getting. And as you linger just beyond the sleeping quarters, still itchy, still trying not to breathe through your nose, you begin to notice how many kinds of exchanges are taking place here, and how few involve actual money. For the clientele here ranges from fishmongers to minor nobles, soldiers with blood on their boots, to desperate apprentices looking for something to dull the ache of living. And the economy of this place is a strange and untraceable current, where favors, information, and promises hold more weight than silver groats, and where what you offer might be accepted or laughed at depending on who's watching, who you owe, or who you accidentally offended by sitting on their preferred straw pile last night. And when you try to hand a coin to a narrow-eyed woman with hair like soot and posture like someone used to avoiding knives, she stares at it like you've offered her a fishbone and then, without a word, walks away, leaving you with the realization that perhaps payment isn't just about silver, but also about context. And maybe, just maybe, you're the one being evaluated here, not the other way around. And as you watch others transact around you, it becomes clearer. One man trades 3 links of sausage for an hour in the back. Another hands over a tiny pouch of herbs that smell faintly of fennel and something more illicit. And yet another simply whispers into someone's ear and gets pulled behind a curtain. No coins exchanged, no nods given, and you realize this is not a linear economy. It's a web of obligation, favor, and barter, where the brothel keeper, the madam or master, depending on the city or decade, acts less like a manager and more like a godfather, granting permissions, assigning rooms, and keeping ledger, not with ink but memory. And historians still argue whether some of these brothels functioned more like feudal micro-societies than businesses, complete with their own hierarchies, enforcers, couriers, and rituals. And your coin honestly earned or not is just a pebble in a storm. And as you stand there dumbfounded, a man brushes past you, wearing what looks like a bishop's cloak, though it's been repurposed with patches and soot stains, and he smells more like ale than incense, and he tosses a fat pigeon toward a woman seated on a stool, who catches it expertly and vanishes into the hallway. And you can't help but marvel at how poultry seems to be a common currency here, which isn't entirely surprising, as chickens were one of the few portable, renewable assets a poor man might own. And in a time when coinage varied wildly between regions and was often clipped or counterfeit, animals were far more reliable, and sometimes payment took the form of labor repairs to a roof, fetching water, sweeping straw especially, if the brothel was located on the fringes of town, where services were scarce and workers were expected to contribute beyond their bodies. And in some cases, clients who couldn't pay outright were offered deals. Work in the stables for a week, guard the back door at night, deliver a package to someone you'll be told about later, and this often led to conscription into other, less legal enterprises tied to the brothel's shadow economy. And before you scoff at the idea, consider that many medieval brothels were tied to smuggling rings, information networks, or even minor guild activity, particularly in larger cities like London, Paris, or Florence, where the line between underworld and upperworld was a thread constantly being tugged. And you begin to see that coin alone marks you as an outsider, a simpleton, someone who thinks value is measured in minted silver rather than in trust, leverage, or silence. And that becomes painfully clear when a wiry man with one eye and far too many rings on his fingers steps toward you and asks, in a voice like crushed gravel, what you're doing standing there like a statue holding money. And you mutter something about paying for lodging or maybe food, and he just laughs a laugh without mirth. More of a barcand says something about how that coin won't buy you safety, let alone a good night, unless you know who to hand it to. And before you can ask what he means, he jerks his head toward a side room where a table is set up with a strange assortment of items: belt buckles, candlesticks, dried herbs, a dented goblet, 2 live frogs in a cage. And you realize this isn't just a brothel, it's a market, a trading post where the workers themselves sometimes barter for what they need to survive another week. And you overhear a discussion about a client who paid with a mirror from the East, possibly Venetian, possibly stolen, which the madam refused because it was rumored to carry a curse. And you're beginning to understand just how layered this place is, where even objects carry stories, and value isn't just economic, but emotional, spiritual, even superstitious. And there's a story told quietly among the workers about a man who once tried to pay in holy relics, claiming they were fragments of St. Agnes' veil. And while most laughed, one older woman accepted the trade and wore the cloth around her wrist until the night she died, never once explaining why. And that's the sort of truth that can't be priced, and even in the academic circles, Some debate lingers around whether the economics of brothels provided more independence to women than other labor options of the time, with some scholars arguing that women could, in theory, accumulate enough wealth or influence to eventually buy property, bribe officials, or even fund small chapels, while others contend that this was the exception, not the rule, and most remained trapped in cycles of debt, disease, and dependency. And as you fumble with your now seemingly useless coin, you catch the eye of a young boy sitting cross-legged in the hallway, watching you with a smirk far too knowing for someone his age. And he beckons you over, offers you a crust of bread in exchange for your shoes. And while the offer is absurd, it does make a twisted kind of sense in this place, where walking barefoot might be safer than walking naive, and you're starting to wonder whether the real currency in a medieval brothel was always desperation dressed in different disguises. And you pocket your coin, not because you've learned the system, but because you finally understand you never will. It's sometime in the dead of night or maybe early morning, but time has ceased to mean anything in this place where light never truly enters, where torches flicker with exhausted resignation, and the damp air presses into your skin like a sour second layer. And you're realizing with an unshakable sense of dread that no one here is really sleeping, not properly, not deeply, because the walls are too thin, the floors too cold, and the sounds too invasive. The shifting of bodies, the whispered arguments, the cough that sounds too wet to be benign. And sleep in a medieval brothel isn't rest. It's just a temporary retreat, a truce your body makes with the chaos around you. And you try to lie still. You really do, nestled into your corner of dirty straw that smells vaguely of mildew and something you refuse to identify. And you pretend that the shadow looming against the wall isn't someone watching, just a trick of the torchlight. But you keep your hands close, one over your pouch of coin now, long useless hand, the other near your boot knife, which you've never used, but tonight feels heavier with potential, because this is the hour when the rules soften, when the brothel's strange rhythm tilts toward menace, when those who couldn't afford the front room slip in through the back, and when jealousies simmering all day rise to a boil, and you've already seen two men hauled away with broken noses and bloodied ears, heard someone scream behind a curtain only to be shushed by a voice like gravel and wine, and you wonder again if you should leave, if your curiosity has finally overstayed its welcome. But the thing about a brothel like this is it consumes indecision like wine, and even your thoughts feel fogged now, diluted by the cloying mix of perfume, sweat, and desperation. And as you close your eyes, or try to, you start to hear the murmurs, the soft snippets of conversation leaking through walls like water. Talk of guards bribed with spiced wine, of a nobleman who visits once a week in disguise, of a young woman who supposedly hexed a client with nothing but a look. And whether true or not, the stories linger, infecting your mind like the fleas infecting your clothes. And you begin to realize that in this hour, the brothel becomes something else entirely, less a place of transaction and more a stage for raw, unfiltered humanity. And somewhere in the shadows, a soft sobbing begins, not dramatic, just tired, and it reminds you of something ancient and universal. The knowledge that sleep, real sleep, requires a kind of safety that no one here has ever known. And that's when you notice it's a woman from earlier, the one with the soot-colored hair and two sharp eyes, sitting near the door with her arms around her knees. Not watching you, but definitely aware of you. And when your gaze meets hers, She doesn't flinch or smile, just stares, and you get the feeling that in this place, night watchers are more valuable than any guard. And it strikes you then just how vulnerable everyone is here. Not just the clients or the workers, but even the madam, who you glimpsed earlier counting coins behind a half-closed door. Her face more lined than you'd remembered, her hands trembling slightly with exhaustion. And it occurs to you that no one is truly in control. Here, not really, because the night has its own logic, its own hierarchy. And historians still argue whether brothels like this operated under internal rules strictly enforced by workers themselves, or if these places simply teetered on a knife's edge of improvisation and necessity, where the threat of chaos was the only deterrent against actual chaos. And the scholars point to coded signal certain knocks, specific phrases, even designated sleeping spots that may have served as a kind of informal order, a choreography of survival within the disorder. And as you shift slightly, trying not to wake the snoring man beside you, whose breath smells like fermented onions and bad decisions, you hear something shift above you, maybe in the rafters or the crawl space, and you freeze, not out of fear, exactly, but from the knowledge that, whatever it is, it's part of this place, just like the smells and the creaks and the stains. And you think briefly of the outside world, of clean sheets and wooden beds, and the ridiculous luxury of a closed door. And it hits you how far from all that you are now, not just in miles, but in mood, in grime, in the way your body feels heavier, not from fatigue, but from atmosphere. Like the air here carries weight, and it's no surprise really, since most brothels weren't built for comfort, often converted from old tenements or abandoned inns with low ceilings and poorly patched holes that let in rats and let out secrets. And you remember reading somewhere, or maybe you heard it in a tavern, that some brothels used to have communal sleeping halls where the girls and guests slept side by side, not out of trust, but due to a lack of space and privacy. And it seems absurd now that you ever thought this would be manageable, let alone interesting. And as you finally begin to drift not into sleep, but into a dazed semi-consciousness, your mind wanders to strange places. To the boy who tried to trade bread for your shoes, to the pigeon used as currency, to the mirror supposedly cursed by Saint Agnes. And you start to wonder if sleep itself isn't a real luxury here, more rare than wine or warmth or even clean water. And maybe that's why everyone seems so hollow-eyed, so watchful, because sleep is when the stories start, but also when they end, and no one here wants to miss the next one. And your last thought before the haze takes you is that you'll never think of nighttime the same way again. Not as peace, but as a test, an examination of who you are when the lights go low and the lies come easy. And you know now that in a medieval brothel, surviving the night doesn't mean getting rested, it means making it to dawn with your dignity, your pouch, and your pulse still intact. By now your body has fully betrayed you, each joint stiff with grime, your stomach waging a quiet rebellion from the mystery stew you agreed to earlier, something grayish and chewy that might have been lamb or rat. And at this point, you don't even care, because the sunrise, or what passes for it, has done nothing to freshen the air or improve the general temperament of the brothel where everything is somehow both louder and more sour in the pale morning light, if that word even applies to the flickering spill of torch glow that gives the walls their jaundiced hue. And as you shuffle toward the communal trough that's been optimistically labeled as a wash basin, you begin to appreciate just how poorly medieval hygiene fits with modern sensibilities. Because whatever ritual passes for cleanliness here involves a splash of brownish water, a shared rag that may or may not have been a shirt in a previous life, and a liberal application of rose oil to cover the smell of everyone else doing exactly the same thing. And it's in this deeply unromantic moment, as you wring out a wet cloth that smells suspiciously like meat, that you realize how important illusion is in a place like this. Because even the dirtiest corner of the brothel tries to pretend it's something else. Sheets are draped like canopies. Broken furniture is painted gold on one side only, and a cracked mirror hangs proudly in the hallway like a relic of nobility. And you can't help but admire the commitment to the bit, because illusion is survival here, for the workers especially, who wake up before everyone else, hair already twisted into loops, makeup applied with coal and soot, and the kind of precision that makes you forget this is probably the third day. They've worn the same dress, and they move with a kind of sleepy efficiency, chatting softly in dialects you don't quite catch, passing cups of morning broth to each other and laughing at some joke that may or may not involve you. And it's disarming, this sense of routine. Because after the surreal nightmare of last night, you expected the morning to feel like relief. But instead, it feels like more of the same, just with better lighting. And as you follow the scent of something vaguely edible wafting from the kitchen, you overhear an argument in the next room, voices low but urgent, and you gather enough words to know it's about money. Which shouldn't surprise you, but does, because for all the drama and romance attached to brothels and stories, most of it comes down to economics. Who gets paid? Who doesn't? Who owes what to whom? And historians still argue whether most medieval brothels operated as independent businesses run by women, or whether they were more often than not owned by male landlords who extracted rent and fees under threat of expulsion, or worse. And here, in this establishment, it becomes painfully clear that while the madam runs the floor, someone else owns the walls, because you hear a name mentioned, name said like a curse, and it carries the weight of power of absence of someone who doesn't live here but affects everything that happens. And as you step into the main hall, the effect is jarring. Last night's mess has been swept into corners, the straw beaten down into submission, and the girls sit at various angles of feigned casualness, waiting for the next round of visitors. Because while you may have just survived the worst night of your life, for them it's just another shift, another day of pretense, politics, and profit. And the thing no one tells you about brothels is how much of it is negotiation, not just with clients, but with each other. A constant dance of alliances and rivalries, pecking orders built not on strength but on favors, secrets, and proximity to the madam's good side. And you're beginning to grasp that no one stays long at the top here, because favoritism is as fickle as fashion. And what earns praise one day earns scorn the next. And so the workers smile at each other while tracking who eats first, who gets to bed closest to the wall, who was allowed to leave the building last week for an actual walk. And it's this hierarchy, fluid, silent, brutal, that makes the brothel more than just a house of pleasure. It's a world complete with its own social codes, unwritten laws, and petty monarchies. And just as you're processing this, a man stumbles in from the side entrance, armor half unbuckled, face flushed with alcohol, or maybe shame, and he tries to joke, to charm, but the room doesn't respond. There's a collective stillness, a tension you don't quite understand, until one of the older women, the one with the limp and the silver comb in her hair, quietly walks over and leads him out. Not with force, but with the kind of practiced confidence that suggests she's done this before. Many times, and everyone lets out a breath, including you, and it dawns on you that danger here doesn't always come screaming. It can also creep, smirk, and try to pay extra to get around the rules. And the rules, though invisible, are real. No violence in the morning, no drunkards before noon. No one under the age of 15 allowed near the back rooms. Though everyone knows that rule's only as strong as the money trying to break it. And your gut twists a little at that. Because even though the brothel feels like a place where bad things happen, it's also a place where worse things are barely kept at bay by people who've had to become their own shields, their own lawmakers, their own historians. And as you sip a chipped mug of barley tea that tastes like damp hay and regret, someone sits beside you, a boy, maybe 16, with eyes too old for his face, who asks if you're leaving today, and you nod without thinking, but you don't really know if you are, and he just says, "Good," before walking off, leaving you unsure whether he meant it as hope or warning. And you realize that survival in this place isn't just about staying alive, it's about staying relevant, staying useful, staying out of the wrong kind of spotlight. And it's no wonder that many brothel workers, even in the better documented red light districts, like those in Toulouse or Sulark, developed elaborate personas, characters they wore like armor to entertain, seduce, and most importantly, deflect. And the more you see, the more you understand that every smile is calculated, every tear strategic, because sincerity doesn't sell, but illusion does. And as you rise to your feet, bones creaking, dignity hanging by a thread, you understand that even if you make it out, you'll never see the world the same way again. Because once you've lived inside the machinery of pleasure and performance, once you've seen what the night strips away and what the morning tries desperately to rebuild, you carry that knowledge with you forever, like a smell that doesn't wash out, like a song you didn't mean to learn but can't stop humming. You leave the main hall, or at least you try to, but the corridors of the brothel don't so much guide you as absorb you. Their narrowness and identical-looking corners tricking you into turning back on yourself again and again, until it's impossible to tell whether you're actually moving toward the exit or just deeper into the belly of this place. And you start to suspect that the architecture is intentional, designed less like a building and more like a labyrinth where time folds in on itself and even the air grows heavier the further you go. But eventually you emerge into a part of the brothel you haven't yet seen, quieter, more dimly lit, with fewer voices and more closed doors. And it's here you realize that the building isn't just divided by purpose. There's also a spatial caste system. Because while the front rooms are for show and the common areas for noise, these back corridors are for secrets. And the moment you step into this silence, something shifts, like stepping onto sacred ground, and the floorboards are softer here, not from luxury, but from rot. The rugs underfoot, threadbare, but carefully laid, and the portraits on the walls, though faded and peeling, depict saints and sinners in equal measure. Their eyes following you with the kind of vague disapproval that makes your neck itch. And it's in this hushed stretch of hallway that you begin to understand something deeper about how brothels functioned in the medieval world, not just as places of commerce or vice, but as archives of unspoken history, repositories for the things society couldn't look at directly, like power imbalances, female agency, or the dark algebra of survival. And as you pass a narrow alcove where a girl no older than 14 sews a torn bodice with fingers too practiced for her age. She looks up at you, not startled, not embarrassed, just mildly curious, as if to say, "You're not supposed to be here." And she's right, because this wing isn't for customers. Not really. And as you continue moving, you notice that the layout subtly shifts against ceilings. Lower walls closer to torch brackets, replaced with small oil lamps, emitting a softer glow. And you start to wonder whether these areas were purpose-built for discretion, or if the building simply adapted to its needs, over time growing like a fungus toward profit and away from light. And as you reach the far end of the hall, you come to a thick wooden door that creaks open before you touch it, revealing a small room that might once have been a study, filled now with shelves of ledger books, jars of dried herbs, a crucifix whose eyes are worn smooth from years of absent-minded thumb-rubbing. And in the center sits the madam herself, not the one from the front desk, but the real one, the one who doesn't talk to clients and doesn't need to, because her authority is baked into the mortar of the walls. And she's older than you expected, not in years, but in weight, in presence. Her body a map of hard choices, and her gaze the kind that stops confessions before they start. And she gestures for you to sit without speaking, as if this moment was already scheduled. And you obey because of course you do. And for a long time there's only silence, punctuated by the rhythmic scratching of her quill as she updates a ledger written in a shorthand you don't recognize. And when she finally speaks, her voice is like smoke's off curling dangerous sand. She asks you the kind of question that isn't really a question. You've seen enough. And you say yes, though you aren't sure if you have. And she studies you for a moment, then nods as if filing you away in some mental cabinet, and launches into a monologue. Not for your benefit, but for her own. A kind of incantation that outlines how the brothel has survived through plague, famine, war, and worse. How kings have passed through these halls in disguise, and how popes have tried and failed to shut them down. How the women hear her girls. She calls them are smarter than any noble's daughter, and more loyal than any squire. And how the brothel exists in a parallel world with its own justice, its own currency, its own gods. And you sit there, entranced as she speaks of the secret network of couriers who carry messages sewn into corset seams. The way-coded rings worn on the left or right-hand signal who's safe and who isn't. The potions made in the back rooms to treat fevers, or fake pregnancies, or sometimes cause them. And you realize that while historians still argue about whether brothels were spaces of female empowerment or brutal exploitation, the truth is too slippery for either label, because both exist simultaneously here, constantly shifting based on who's speaking and who's listening. And just as you start to ask a question, she cuts you off with a glance, opens a drawer, and places a small object on the table, a carved wooden figurine of a fox curled around a dagger, and says, "Take this, and when they stop you, show them that." And you want to ask who they are, but her expression makes it clear that you don't get to know. Not yet, maybe not ever. And so you nod, take the figurine, and leave, your fingers closing around its weight, like it's a relic or a weapon. And as you retrace your steps through the corridor, the brothel feels different again, like it's watching you now, assessing you. And when you pass the girl with the needle, she smiles this time, like maybe you passed a test you didn't know you were taking. And by the time you return to the front hall, the sun has actually risen, though it barely filters through the filthy windows, and the brothel is awake in full. Laughter, footsteps, bargains, a baby crying somewhere upstairs, and you walk through it all, unnoticed, the figurine still in your pocket. your body aching, your mind numb, and you think about how none of this could be captured in a painting or a poem or even a historian's footnotes. Because this brothel isn't just a place, it's a living contradiction, gritty and sacred, exploitative and protective, terrifying and strangely tender, and you finally understand why people never really leave it the same way they entered. You don't make it far before realizing that leaving the brothel is more complicated than simply walking out the front door. Because the moment your foot hits the threshold, a burly man in a leather jerkin appears as if conjured, not angry but unmoving. His bulk silently reminding you that no one exits without permission or explanation. And while you could protest or argue, something in his stillness tells you that wouldn't be wise. So instead you fumble for the figurine the madam gave you, producing the tiny wooden fox like a charm against misfortune. And his eyes flick to it, then to your face, and without a word, he steps aside, letting you pass with a grunt that could mean anything from lucky you to you won't get far. And the sunlight outside hits you like a slap. Too bright, too real, too clean, making the alley you step into feel foreign. Like waking up from a dream, only to find the world hasn't waited for you. And the city is already bustling, vendors yelling, donkeys braying, church bells ringing their metallic reminder that God is watching. Even if Hayes chosen to avert his gaze from the district you've just escaped, and you wander in a daze, your senses overwhelmed by the sheer density of life. Every cobblestone vibrating with motion and smell and noise. And it strikes you how the brothel, for all its chaos, was a kind of cocoon. A self-contained universe where rules, however warped, existed. And now outside of it, you feel exposed, like an animal released from captivity, only to discover the forest is worse than the cage. And as you drift through the market, you catch snippets of gossip and sermon, of merchants hawking amulets guaranteed to cure sin, of a friar railing against temptation while eyeing the thighs of a baker's wife, and everywhere you turn, there are signs that the brothel isn't some hidden corner of society, but its crooked mirror, reflecting all the hypocrisy and hunger of the world at large, just with more honesty. And you pass a group of young boys, playing at nights, one of them using a broomstick as a lance and yelling about dragons, and you wonder how many of them will grow into men who visit the very place you just left, seeking comfort or conquest or just the illusion of power, and how many will end up broken by the same forces that feed it. And it occurs to you that in some ways, the brothel is more honest than the church because, at least, it doesn't pretend that desire is clean or manageable. And as you make your way toward the river hoping the sound of water will clear your head, you're stopped by an old woman selling herbs from a woven basket, her eyes sharp and knowing, and she points at you, muttering something in Latin or maybe just gibberish, and presses a small pouch into your hand, whispering for the dreams, before disappearing into the crowd. And you don't know whether to be grateful or afraid, but you pocket the pouch anyway. Because after a night like yours, every charm helps. And finally, you reach the edge of the city, where the stench of refuse and tanneries thickens the air. And you sit on a broken wall, overlooking the brown water below, letting the sounds of the city dull into background noise. And you start to reflect on what the night has done to you. Not just physically, though. Your limbs are sore and your skin feels wrong, but spiritually. Because there's a kind of violation in being so close to so much human transaction. Like your own soul has been pawned off, and you're not sure who holds the ticket. And you think about the women, how they laughed, how they fought, how they survived by turning performance into power, and how even in their most vulnerable moments they held more agency than many nobles in their castles. Because at least they understood the game they were playing, while others pretend their masks are faces and a thought surfaces slow and unwelcome. That maybe you weren't just a visitor, that maybe everyone is part of the brothel, whether they know it or not, just playing different roles on a broader stage. And historians still argue whether brothels in the medieval era were isolated dens of immorality or deeply embedded institutions tied to civic life, protected by some city officials, persecuted by others, taxed heavily by both. And you now suspect the answer is yes to all of the above. That these establishments were both shunned and needed, hidden and central, just like the desires they catered to. And as the day wears on, you watch as a procession winds through the street, below priests in white, girls with flower crowns, some saints' bones carried in a glass case by sweaty men, and people kneeling as it passes, their expressions equal parts awe and obligation. And you wonder how many of them will make that same walk tomorrow in the opposite direction, toward the brothel after sundown, and how many prayers were whispered last night between sips of wine and moans of pleasure. And it strikes you that this constant oscillation between sin and penance isn't a flaw of medieval life, but its very rhythm. And you begin to see the brothel not as a contradiction of the sacred, but as its necessary counterpart, a place where desire is allowed to breathe, so it doesn't poison everything else. And suddenly, the pouch in your pocket feels heavier, like it holds more than herbs, like it holds the residue of everything you've witnessed. And you remember the madam's words about messages sewn into corsets. And it clicks, maybe the figurine isn't just a pass, but a message. Maybe you were supposed to deliver something. Maybe you already have. And the realization chills you, because it means you were used without even knowing it. A courier wrapped in naivety. And now you wonder whether the woman who gave you that stew, or the boy who said good, or the girl sewing by the torchlight, were all part of the same script, and you just played your role. And maybe that's the final lesson the brothel teaches, that everyone is acting all the time, and the only real difference is whether you know it. And as you stand up to leave, unsure of where to go, but certain you can't stay, you catch your reflection in a puddle, filthy sunken-eyed, not quite yourself, and you don't know if that's from what happened or from what it revealed about who you really are. But either way, you walk away changed, the city closing around you with the same indifference it greeted you with. And for the rest of your life, no matter where you go, there will be a part of you still wandering those torchlit halls, still hearing the creak of beds and the clink of coin, still tasting ash in your mouth and the bitterness of truth dressed in perfume. You wonder for what feels like hours, the city folding in on itself with every turn you take, each street a copy of the last, lined with shuttered stalls and sagging door frames. And you start to suspect that the town is not just large but shifting, rearranging itself behind you like a maze that feeds on disorientation. And your mind, already frayed from the night, begins to blur the edges of what's real and what's remembered. And that's when you start seeing them women in veils watching from balconies, beggars who look familiar, doors that creak open a sliver and then slam shut when you pass. And there's this creeping sense that the brothel hasn't let you go, not entirely, like you've brought some fragment of it with you, a curse or a scent or an aura that marks you as one of them now. Not a client, not quite a witness, but something in between. And that's when you hear the music not joyous music, not the kind that spills from taverns, but something slower, sadder, drawn from strings or throats you can't see, and it's coming from an alley up ahead, narrow enough that you shouldn't care, but you do, because the sound pulls at your gut like memory, and so you follow it, stepping into shadow without hesitation. And in the gloom, you find a courtyard, cracked stone and moss, and in the center, a dancer moving to the song you can't quite locate, her steps hypnotic, less performance than ritual, and around her are others, silent, seated, watching with expressions that suggest they've forgotten they were ever anything else but watchers. And as you edge closer, no one stops you, but they do notice, and you take a seat like they did. Unsure why, and only after several minutes do you realize that the dancer is blindfolded, her movements flawless, unhurried, as though each step has already been taken 1,000 times before and will be taken again after her body forgets her name. And it hits you. This isn't entertainment. This is remembrance. And you begin to understand that in this world, the medieval brothel's extended landscape of shadow stories aren't told. They're reenacted, danced or sung or whispered into brick until the walls themselves memorize them. And someone beside you, an old man with too many teeth and not enough hair, leans over and says, "She's dancing the sickness." And when you glance at him, he adds, "The plague took her family. This is how she keeps them alive." And you want to ask what that means, how that's even possible. But something about the way he says it makes you stay quiet. And historians still argue whether these urban courtyards, tucked between inns and tenements, were places of commerce, theater, or magic. But what you're seeing here defies categorization, because it feels sacred and desperate and deeply human. And as the dancer's movements slow, the music fading into silence you never actually heard begin, everyone simply gets up and leaves, not in haste, not in ceremony, just as though the spell has ended and now life must resume, and you follow, because what else can you do? And the moment you step back into the main road, the day feels louder, more angular, and you feel a strange urge to laugh or cry or lie down in the dust and let the sun bleach your thoughts. But instead, you keep walking, pulled toward the cathedral at the city's center, because you remember now what one of the women said last night, that the bishop is a regular, that his confessions are rehearsed, and his silences are strategic, and you want to see for yourself whether the house of God looks any different after a night spent in one of his blind spots. And when you reach it, towering and silent despite the bustling plaza, the stained glass glittering like frozen fire, you slip inside through the side door, unnoticed by the friars rearranging candles or brushing dust from the pews. And the quiet here is different, heavier, curated, as if silence itself is being curated, like incense. And as you sit in the back row, watching the slow shuffle of penitents and priests, you realize that both the brothel and the church operate on the same currency: guilt, confession, ritual, a hunger to be absolved of something, whether it's sin or desire or the aching loneliness that comes from pretending you're whole. And suddenly, a procession of choir boys drifts down the aisle, their voices high and pure, and for a moment you feel clean, or at least capable of imagining. But the feeling is brief, because the bishop appears behind them, his robes immaculate, his face beatific, and though he never glances your way, you know deep in your bones that he recognizes you, and not just vaguely, but specifically. And the chill that creeps up your spine is colder than anything you felt in the brothel, because here, under vaulted ceilings and divine frescoes, The stakes feel higher, the hypocrisy sharper, and you watch him mount the pulpit, deliver a sermon about virtue and vigilance, and you see the heads nod, the prayers muttered, and you think about how many of these faces will bow to him in daylight and kneel to others in darkness, and you begin to suspect that every structure in this city, sacred or profane, is just a different wing of the same labyrinth. And maybe the only real difference is lighting, and you stay until the sermon ends, until the incense thickens and the air feels too holy to breathe, and then you leave, slipping out through a side cloister, past a nun who doesn't smile but watches you with the same recognition you saw in the dancer's blindfolded twirl, the same recognition the madam had when you first stepped inside her ledgers, and by the time you reach the outer district, the sun is falling low again, casting everything in gold and blood, and you find yourself back at the edge of the marketplace where the herb woman stood, but she's gone now, and in her place is a boy with bandaged hands, selling wax seals carved with strange symbols, and you ask him what they're for, and he shrugs, says, protection, and when you ask, from what, he just points toward the brothel's direction and says, depends on what followed you, and you don't know if Hayes mocking or warning you, but you buy one anyway, not because you believe it works, but because now you can't afford to assume it doesn't, and you realize this is how the brothel survives, not just by coin or secrecy, but by echo, by the way it embeds itself into everyone who brushes against it, and suddenly the pouch in your pocket feels warm, and you wonder if you should open it, scatter it, bury it, but instead you just grip it tighter and keep walking, because the night is coming again. And you know what waits in its folds isn't just temptation or memory, it's reflection. And now you're starting to see your own shape in the shadows. You don't notice at first how heavy your limbs have become until you try to climb a shallow hill at the city's edge, and your legs protest like rusted hinges, your breath coming in shallow huffs that taste like soot and regret, and that's when it dawns on you that sleep, true sleep, hasn't touched you since before you ever stepped foot in the brothel. And maybe that was only a day ago, or maybe 3. But time has a way of slipping sideways here, turning soft and unreliable, like overcooked beans or political promises. And as you crest the hill, you find yourself at the edge of a small encampment just outside the city walls. Shabby tents and makeshift shelters, the kind thrown together by people who either aren't allowed inside or have chosen, perhaps wisely, to stay away. And the smell here is different, earthier, tinged with herbs, and the quiet buzz of activity feels more communal than transactional. A strange comfort after everything you've been through, and you're greeted not with suspicion, but with casual glances, as if everyone here has seen people like you before, people who emerge from the underbelly of the city with haunted eyes and a pouch full of bad decisions. Among them, a figure catches your attention, an older woman tending to a fire, her face weathered but sharp, the kind of face that's seen plagues, fires, births, and executions, and remembers all of them vividly. And without invitation, she gestures for you to sit, which you do because resistance feels like a thing for people with energy. And as she stirs a pot of something pungent, she begins to speak not to you directly, but into the air, as though continuing a story already in progress, telling of girls stolen from border villages, sold not for gold but favors, traded into brothels, not with chains, but with false promises. And she speaks of the women who survive, how they become madams or midwives, or simply disappear into walls. and the tone of her voice is neither mournful nor bitter. It's matter of fact, the way one talks about weather or taxes. And as she finally turns to meet your gaze, she says, "You carry it," and you want to ask what it is. But you already know some blend of memory and taint and awareness that marks you, not visibly, but energetically, like a scent only certain people can detect. And she offers you a bowl of her concoction, and despite the smell half garlic, half something more primal you drink, because refusing feels like it would be worse. And the warmth that spreads through your chest is almost immediate. But it's not comforting, it's revealing, as though your blood is being forced to remember something it tried very hard to forget. And suddenly your thoughts spiral back not to the brothel, this time, but to the waiting room outside. The way everyone's eyes were trained, not on the door, but on the ledger. The book that recorded every name, every price, every whisper of history. And you wonder who keeps that book now. Who updates it when a woman dies or vanishes or bites her tongue in protest? And historians still argue whether these brothels were regulated with actual oversight or simply taxed into submission. But you're starting to understand that records like those don't just track economics, they track silence, complicity, and the slow erosion of what it means to feel outrage. And the woman beside you mutters something in a dialect you don't recognize, then says in clearer speech, "Don't let it harden you." And you're about to ask again what it is when a commotion erupts near the edge of camp. A pair of guards trying to drag someone back toward the city. And the people hear quiet moments a ghostly move as one, creating a wall of bodies between the guards and their target. And you watch this silent protest, this coordinated refusal, and realize these are not just outcasts, but exiles, people who chose community over corruption. And the guards, frustrated and outnumbered, eventually leave. And you see the woman smile faintly, as though this outcome was inevitable. And you start to wonder, how many brothel workers escape to places like this? How many find healing or just a slower form of damage? And the woman tells you to rest, that sleep here is not only safe, but medicinal. And she leads you to a covered spot with straw and a woven blanket. And when you lie down, your eyes close before your mind can object. And the dreams that come are thick with symbols. A door that won't open, a song sung backward, a hand offering a key that turns to dust. And when you wake, the sky is pale and the camp is quieter. And you feel something new in your chest, not peace, exactly, but a less jagged form of anxiety. And as you sit up, the woman is gone, her fire cold, and you realize you don't know her name. And maybe she never had one that could be spoken outside this place. And you return to the city slowly, passing merchants, setting up stalls, children chasing pigs, the world spinning on as though nothing has changed. But you've changed, and the streets seem less like stone and more like arteries, pumping 1,000 quiet violences through the city's veins. And you walk past the brothel without stopping. But you look at it, and it looks back, not with malice, but with the indifference of a monument still there, still absorbing people and stories and regrets. And you think of the ledger again, of who updates it, and you wonder if your name is in it now, and whether that makes you a customer, a witness, or just another footnote in its long, bitter history. You head east, away from the brothel's long shadow and the cathedral's cold silence, trying to chase something that might resemble closure or at least distraction. Your boots scuffing the uneven stones as you pass through an artisan quarter where the smell of leather and hot metal mingles with the distant scent of dung. And you realize just how many people live lives that barely graze the underworld you just crawled out of. How they hammer shoes, stir, dye, cut cloth, argue over grain prices, and live with the illusion that the city is structured, comprehensible, safe. And yet even here, beneath the bright canvas awnings and the rhythmic clang of hammers, you notice the undercurrents. The girl sweeping outside a cobbler's shop with bruises on her wrists. The blacksmith's apprentice who flinches at sudden sounds. The way an old man watches everyone with the practiced vigilance of someone who's seen what can happen when you're not careful. And you begin to understand that the brothel isn't just a building or a business. It's a pressure point, a convergence. The way storm drains collect the worst runoff, and it leaks into every layer of the city, subtly, persistently, reshaping everything it touches. And as you turn a corner, a commotion pulls you toward a square where a cart has overturned, and a group of children scrambles to steal apples, while the vendor shouts curses you're pretty sure are centuries old. And amidst the chaos, you spot a figure or woman in muted red. Not the bright crimson of the brothel, but a softer, faded tone, almost like old wine. And you recognize her, not from a specific moment, but from an overall presence, like a memory you didn't know you had. And as your eyes meet, there's a flicker of something like recognition, though you can't tell if it's hers or yours. And she approaches you with a calm that feels out of place in the crowded marketplace, asking not who you are or what you want, but simply, did you get out? And you don't know how to answer, because what does it mean to get out if the place still lives in your muscles, if its voices still echo behind your thoughts? And she seems to understand without explanation, nodding slowly, then gesturing toward a narrow path between two buildings, a shortcut or an escape. And you follow her, not because you trust her, but because right now you don't trust your own sense of direction. And the alley opens into a courtyard you haven't seen before, quiet, clean, lined with orange trees and painted tiles that suggest Moorish hands at work. And she sits on the edge of a fountain, motioning for you to do the same, and you oblige, feeling like a child being invited into a secret. And she begins to speak, her voice low, rhythmic, as though she's reciting something she's told many times, about how she came to the brothel, not through force, but hunger, not from chains, but choices that narrowed until only one remained, how the madam saw something in her, a poise, a voice, a silence that drew attention and offered her not salvation, but agency, and how, for a time, that illusion was enough, until the cost became too great. And she tells you how she faked a sickness to be moved to the infirmary, how she learned enough herbal lore to mimic a wasting illness and convinced a merchant's wife to buy her freedom in exchange for false promises of spiritual cleansing. And as she speaks, you feel both admiration and discomfort, because her story is too detailed, too deliberate, like a play performed for royalty, and you wonder how much of it is true and how much is necessary for survival. And she finishes by saying, they let you go when they think you're empty. And you feel that in your chest, like a bell rung too close to your ears. And you look around the courtyard and notice it. Now the other figures seated quietly under trees, beside planters, on steps, dozens of them, mostly women, all listening or waiting or remembering. And you realize this place is a sanctuary of sorts, not holy, not legal, but real in the way moss is real, in the way it grows only where the air is still and forgotten. And she says they meet here to unlearn, to drain out the poison in their stories by sharing it, piece by piece, until it becomes memory instead of identity. and historians still argue whether such refuges existed in the rigid social structures of the medieval world. But oral histories and private letters suggest they did, quietly, fleetingly, like wildflowers after rain, and you sit for what feels like hours, listening to voices rise and fall, some choked, some defiant, none of them seeking your sympathy, but simply using your presence as witness. And for once, you don't interrupt, you don't question, you don't flinch. And as the sun begins to lower, casting amber light across the courtyard tiles, someone hands you a piece of bread and a fig. And it tastes better than anything you've had in days. Not because of the ingredients, but because it's given without price or agenda. And in that moment, surrounded by survivors who wear their history without apology, you feel the beginnings of something you didn't think possible. Relief. Not that it's over, but that you're not alone in carrying it. And when you finally stand to leave, the woman in red says, "You'll come back when you're ready to tell yours." And you nod, not because you believe it, but because part of you hopes it's true. And you step back into the city, into its noise and movement. And for the first time, the streets feel navigable, not safe, not innocent, but at least comprehensible. And as you pass a merchant calling out the price of boiled onions, you realize how little most people know about the systems they exist within. How comfort often depends on ignorance, and you vow not to forget, even when forgetting would be easier, even when silence would win you more favor, because now you've seen behind the curtain, and it wasn't just a brothelet, it was a mirror. And what you saw there wasn't just history or scandal, but the scaffolding of society itself. And if that doesn't haunt you, it should. The rain starts without warning, the kind of sudden, heavy downpour that turns packed dirt to slick muck in minutes and sends street vendors scrambling to cover their goods, while barefoot children squeal with delight, darting between puddles like fish in shallow streams. And you pull your cloak tighter, not just for warmth, but because something about this weather makes you feel exposed, like the city itself is watching you more closely. Its alleys darker, its sounds sharper, and as you duck under the awning of a crumbling bathhouse, you realize you've stumbled into a part of town that doesn't appear on any of the merchant maps half abandoned. Strangely quiet, buildings too close together, the windows either shuttered or missing entirely, and the only people you pass are women, older ones mostly, some with baskets of herbs, others with ink-stained fingers, and they all look at you the same way, not afraid, not welcoming, but measuring, like a tailor deciding how much fabric a soul will need. And it occurs to you that this might be one of those informal zones ruled not by law or guild, but by the kind of power no one names directly. And as you follow the narrow path deeper into this forgotten quadrant, you come upon a building so weathered it looks more grown than built, with ivy spilling down the walls and moss curling up around the lintels, and the sign above the door has long since faded, but a faint symbol carved into the stoner crescent moon inside a flame makes something stir in the back of your mind. Something you heard once in passing about healing circles, or maybe ritual baths, or maybe exile homes. And as you step inside, the warmth hits you first, not just from a fire, but from scented steam. And your body reacts before your brain does, your shoulders lowering, your lungs expanding, your jaw unclenching, and an older woman in layered robes appears from behind a beaded curtain, offering you not words, but a small towel, motioning to the stone bench beside a central pool. And again you sit, because refusing feels like a kind of violence in a place like this. And she disappears for a while, leaving you with nothing but the hiss of boiling water and the occasional whisper of wind against the roof tiles. And when she returns, she carries a basin filled with lavender water, a cup of something bitter and green, and a thin sliver of bread with black seeds pressed into the crust. And you take them because you are starting to understand the unspoken transactions of these places' gifts given without price. Care offered not as favor, but duty. And as you sip the liquid, your body hums again, like it did in the herbalist's camp. Only this time, it's more clarifying than disorienting. And the woman begins to speak, her voice surprisingly strong, telling you about the law's actual laws, written and ratified, that govern women's bodies in this region for nearly 200 years, about how brothels were taxed more heavily than any other enterprise except gambling, how girls as young as 12 could be registered under the city's protection if they were orphaned or destitute, and how that protection rarely extended past the reach of the tax collector. And she speaks with the knowledge of someone who has studied more than lived, citing decrees, guild restrictions, foreign correspondence, and at first you wonder why she's telling you all this, until she says that people like you witnesses, who aren't scholars or politicians or churchmen, need to understand that suffering doesn't begin with cruelty. It begins with paperwork, and she presses into your palm a folded page, a reproduction of an actual ledger entry from a nearby brothel dated 1328, listing not names, but initials, ages, services rendered, fees collected, and one small notation beside a girl's mark, deceased cause undetermined. And she says historians still argue whether this entry refers to a death in childbirth, an overdose, or a punishment gone too far. But no one will ever know, because no one asked then, and no one asks now. And she unfolds a scroll on the wall behind her on, an anatomical diagram copied from a centuries-old physician's notes, showing how midwives trained in these same quarters often served as secret doctors for the brothels, how knowledge passed from one pair of hands to another, even as the institutions around them pretended it didn't exist. And she points to the figure's stomach and says, "This is where the memory lives." And you don't know if she means trauma or wisdom or both. But it sticks with you as you rise to thank her, and she smiles, telling you that no one leaves truly clean, but if you're lucky, you leave less infected. And you step back into the rain, which has softened now into a gentle mist, and the streets feel quieter somehow, like your ears have adjusted to a new frequency, one where you can hear the sigh behind a closing door, or the hesitation in a barkeep's greeting, or the story buried in a laundress' silence. And you begin to notice that every district of the city, every guild, every chapel, every market, stall has some thread that connects it to the brothel. Not directly, not always, but subtly, through labor or tax or lineage, and the idea that this one building could be so woven into the city's fabric unsettles you more than any single room ever did. Because now you understand that complicity isn't loud. It's quiet. It's background. It's baked into bricks and mortar. And as you walk, you start to imagine the ledger again, not as a book, but as a network, a spider's web of ink and coin and whispered consent. And you wonder how many pages have been lost, how many entries rewritten, how many lives edited into euphemism. And the thought makes you pause beneath an arched bridge, watching a rat swim effortlessly through the canal below. And you realize that some systems, once built, are nearly impossible to destroy because they don't live in buildings, they live in habits, in language, in what people choose to question and what they don't. And you lean on the railing and try to picture the city without the brothel, not just the building, but the whole structure that enabled it. And your mind draws a blank, because removing it would unravel too much. And you think maybe that's the point. Maybe real change feels like breaking the loom itself. And no one wants that. Not really. Especially not those who think they're untouched. And as you make your way back toward the central square, past bakeries closing shop and children chasing geese, you carry a different kind of exhaustion. Now not fear, not shame, but a heavy awareness. Like you've been entrusted with a truth no one asked you to keep but now can't unknow. And when a man selling chestnuts offers you one, you take it, because sometimes small warmths are all that hold you upright. And as you chew, you remember something the woman said before you left. Something she didn't whisper, but said plainly, as though it were common knowledge. The brothel doesn't disappear when you leave it. It waits. And that might be the truest thing you've heard all night. You don't notice the shift at first, because the night's rhythm has been so deeply ingrained in your senses. Grit underfoot, the low hum of distant voices, that acrid temps of smoke and mildew in the back of your throat. But as you cross the final corner, near the southern gate, the mood starts to thin like mist in a rising wind. And you realize, with a strange flicker of reluctance, that your journey is ending, or at least this part of it is, though the streets still stretch on, crooked and wet, and the buildings still loom, crooked and watching. But there's a quiet to them now, not of peace, but aftermath, the kind that settles in when everyone's said too much, and no one knows what to do with it. And you find yourself lingering by a pile of discarded straw, watching it turn slowly to rot in the gutter, thinking about how everything in this city, from the kitchens to the courts, leaves its waste behind. And in places like the brothel, that waste isn't just broken crockery or stained linens. It's people's whole lives crushed between ledgers and gossip and law. And you wonder, not for the first time, how many of them ever had a chance to walk away, really walk away, not just from the place, but from the stories told about them, from the roles they were forced to play before they even knew they were acting. And this time your thoughts are more detailed, sharper, as if the fog in your mind is lifting and you're finally seeing what you didn't know you'd missed. The way shame was used like currency, the way freedom was sold off in pieces, how survival itself became something to negotiate. And you think about the girl with the ribbon, the one you saw days ago. Was it just hours? And you wonder if she even had a real name, or just a string of aliases that fit the customer's preferences. And you can almost hear her laughing in your head, not cruelly, but knowingly, as if to say, you're late to the joke, and maybe you are. But at least you're here now. And as you pass a flickering torch affixed to a cracked stone wall, you think of another fact the herbalist mentioned about how in 1297, the local clergy attempted to install morality patrols to monitor the brothels under the pretense of spiritual hygiene, a term so ironic it might have made the women laugh themselves to death, if they weren't already dying of worse. And that effort failed, of course, not because the public objected, but because the patrolmen themselves became the best-paying clients. And historians still argue whether this corruption was a calculated subversion or just predictable hypocrisy. But either way, the result was the same. Another layer of illusion painted onto an already theatrical system. And you're reminded again how much of this city's truth is buried under performance. Not just in the brothels, but in the courtrooms and pulpits and workshops. Everyone pretending they don't know what everyone else already accepts. And as you make your way toward a smaller road, branching off into what looks like a tradesman's district, you pass a mural, half-eroded by rain, depicting what you think is a wedding. But closer inspection reveals something different. The bride's eyes are wide, not with joy, but surprise. The officiant's robes are just a little too tattered, and the crowd wears expressions that are somewhere between hunger and boredom. And you think maybe it's a parody, or maybe it's just accurate, depending on how you view marriage in a city where love is often the least negotiable element of partnership. And something in your stomach twists, not from fear or disgust, but the gnawing realization that even this mural tells a more honest story than half the official chronicles you read growing up. And suddenly, it feels like everything around you, every scratched floorboard, every tattered curtain, every chipped goblet is more trustworthy than the polished histories etched in cathedral stone. And as you walk further, you catch sight of a small plaque bolted to a wall, so tarnished it nearly blends into the stone. But you lean in and read what little is left, a dedication to the unnamed workers of the South Ward, and below it, etched by some anonymous hand long after the fact, are the words, "Some gave everything, and no one wrote it down." And your throat tightens, not in sadness, but in that awful, unplaceable mix of grief and shame and gratitude. And you begin to think about what it means to be remembered, not as a statue or a name in a ledger, but as a story someone bothers to tell. And maybe that's what this whole journey has been about. Not exploring filth for the sake of shock, but confronting the parts of history that only survive in whispers. And you wonder if centuries from now, someone will stand in a rebuilt city square, reading a digital plaque or listening to a recreated voice, and whether they'll believe any of this could have been real. And maybe that's why it matters. You are here now, walking these alleys in your mind, absorbing the textures no museum can replicate it. The subtle cruelties no documentary will dare include. And as you approach what must be the edge of the district, where brothels give way to bakeries and stables, and the normal rhythms of city life return, you pause at a small alcove where someone has left a bundle of rosemary tied with red twine, a token of protection or remembrance or both. And though you don't know the custom, you kneel and add a single copper coin beside it, the way you might leave a shell on a grave or a stone on a marker, because it feels wrong to take everything and leave nothing behind. And as you rise and take one last look down the lane, you whisper something, not quite a prayer, more like a promise, that you won't forget not the smells, not the silence, not the ledger or the moon-marked stone or the girl with the ribbon end. You turn your back to the brothel, not as a gesture of dismissal, but as a kind of mourning. And you don't flinch when the wind picks up and carries with it the scent of ash and roses, because you know, now that memory has a scent, and you carry it with you whether you want to or not. You're still walking, though the night has folded itself softer now, like velvet over stone. And the edges of the city no longer scrape at you, but blur gently into quiet shadows and distant echoes, your feet moving slower, no longer driven by fear or purpose, but by the simple rhythm of motion. And it's in that rhythm, in the hush that comes after the last story has been told, that something finally settles in your chest, like the weight of a warm blanket pulled up over you at just the right time. Not to protect, but to soothe. And as you pass by shuttered windows and doors, barely held by their hinges, your eyes trace the flicker of a candle here, the dying glow of embers there, and you realize that behind each of those weak lights is someone else finishing their night too, Someone who maybe also carries things they can't name. Who maybe sat in a brothel once, or worked near one, or never knew they were close until it was too late. And that thought, surprisingly, doesn't fill you with sorrow, but connection. A reminder that memory, even hard memory, has a way of becoming less sharp when shared. And though no one walks beside you now, you feel the presence of those voices from the courtyard. The low laughter of women who survived, and the silent weight of those who didn't. And the wind is gentle now, carrying not smoke but something cleaner. Maybe the first hint of morning dew, or maybe just your mind softening the city's edges so you can rest, and your shoulders drop just slightly, like a release, like your body finally trusting the ground not to betray it, and the stars above blink lazily, as if trying to decide whether to stay or go, and you stop beneath one of the city's taller trees, its branches arching above you like the ribs of a cathedral, and you sit, not because you're tired, but because the moment asks you to. And for the first time since this began, you close your eyes, not to block out the world, but to feel it more fully. The stone beneath you, cool but not cold. The wind brushing against your cheek, like a reminder that even now, the world goes on, indifferent and beautiful. And you breathe in deeply, slowly, letting the memory of candlelight and whispered warnings and rosemary bundles settle somewhere safe inside you. And the sounds around you have softened to near silence. Just a faint creak of old wood, the faraway drip of water into a trough, the occasional rustle of leaves like distant hands tidying up after the night's stories. And with each breath, the images grow dimmer, not forgotten, but softened, faded into the fabric of your thoughts, where they'll stay, not shouting, not accusing, just existing, like a story tucked gently into the folds of your pillow. And as your thoughts begin to stretch out, like limbs after a long confinement, you feel the weight of the night finally easing off your back, and you let it go, not in defiance, but in peace. Because you've walked the path, you've heard the names, you've watched the candle burn down to its last flicker, and now, with the city still around you, but no longer pressing in, you're ready to rest. Not just sleep, but rest. The kind that sinks into your bones and lets the noise fall away like a fading bell. And somewhere, someone might still be watching, still listening, still whispering about the night. You barely survived, but none of that matters now, because you're here. And the world has quieted, and for just a little while, there is nothing more you need to do, nowhere else you need to go, and no stories left to carry alone.